When we face tragedy, one of the first questions that arises in our hearts is, where was God? This question, laden with pain and confusion, seems to whisper in the darkest moments of our lives. The loss of a loved one, especially in tragic circumstances, leaves us feeling alone, helpless, and sometimes even abandoned by the one we trusted. I remember one particular day. I was looking out the window of my house as the sky clouded over. I had received a life-changing call for a close family. Their son, full of life and dreams, had suddenly passed away. His devastated mother repeated through tears, "Why did God allow this? Has He abandoned us?" These questions not only resonated in my heart, but they reminded me that we are not the only ones who have felt this way. In moments of grief, even the strongest people in faith have found themselves questioning God's purposes. But I want to tell you something important. This question does not mean that your faith is weak. On the contrary, it is a reflection of your humanity, of your desire to understand and find answers. Today, I want you to join me on this journey. We are going to explore these concerns from a faith perspective, seeking comfort and hope. I don't promise simple answers, but I assure you that you will find something valuable at the end of this video. Imagine for a moment that, in the midst of the storm, there is a shining beacon. That beacon is the faith that can guide us through the darkness. And although everything seems confusing now, there is one promise that sustains us. God does not abandon us, even when we cannot understand His ways. Stay with me as we tackle this great question. Together we will discover stories that inspire, words that comfort, and truths that strengthen. Because although we cannot avoid pain, we can find purpose and hope in the midst of it. Hope in the midst of pain. It was a peaceful afternoon, until Anna received a call that would change her life forever. On the other end of the line, a trembling voice informed her that her son, a young man full of dreams and energy, had suffered a fatal accident. In that moment, time seemed to stand still. Her world, once filled with laughter and plans, turned dark and silent. Anna spent days in her room, staring at a photo of her son while wondering, "Why, God? Why did you allow this?" Her heart was broken, and with each tear, a new wave of doubts flooded her mind. Was God really there at that moment? Had He abandoned her? The community around her tried to comfort her, but their words failed to soothe the emptiness she felt. In the midst of her grief, Anna began to question not only the purpose of the tragedy, but also her own faith. She had attended church her entire life, prayed and trusted in God. So how could something so devastating happen? One night, while crying silently, Anna found a Bible on her nightstand. She opened it at random and her eyes fell on Psalm 34 verse 18. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." For a moment, it felt as if those words were spoken directly to her. Although, when we face such profound pain like the one Hannah experienced, it's inevitable to ask a question that many have asked throughout history. If God is love and all-powerful, why does He allow suffering? This question is not only valid but universal. From biblical times to the present day, it has touched the hearts of believers and non-believers alike. Think of Job, a righteous man who lost everything. His family, his possessions, even his health. Job cried out to God, asking why He had allowed so much pain in his life. His friends tried to comfort him with explanations, but none calmed his heart. Job, in his anguish, even questioned God's purposes. And yet, at the end of his story, we see that Job finds something greater than answers. He finds God Himself. Through his suffering, Job discovered a powerful truth. Although we don't always understand God's plans, we can trust that He is present and at work amidst the chaos. But how can we apply this to our own lives? In times of crisis, our emotions scream at us that we are alone, that God has forgotten us. However, the reality is different. Often, suffering is not a sign of abandonment, but an opportunity to draw closer to God, to depend on Him in a deeper way. In the midst of pain, it is important to remember that Jesus Himself experienced the deepest suffering. On the cross, He cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Matthew 27 verse 46. These words show that even Jesus, in His humanity, empathized with our experience of pain and abandonment. As we reflect on these stories and promises, we begin to understand that the question is not only why do I suffer, but also, what can I learn and how can I grow through this? Stay with me as we explore how faith can give us strength and purpose amid life's storms. Purpose amid suffering. In the midst of our quest to understand suffering, the Bible offers us a profoundly comforting perspective. Far from ignoring human pain, the Scriptures acknowledge that suffering is a fact of life. However, they also assure us that we do not face this pain alone. In Psalm 34 verse 18 we read, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. He saves those who are crushed in spirit." This verse not only speaks to us of God's closeness but also of His desire to comfort us in our darkest moments. When Hannah encountered this passage after the loss of her son, she felt for the first time that God had not abandoned her. The Bible also shows us that suffering is not a punishment from God. In John 9 verses 1-3, the disciples asked Jesus about a man who was born blind. "Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus replied, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned. This happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him." This passage reminds us that even if we don't always understand the purpose of pain, God can use it for His glory and for our good. Furthermore, the Apostle Paul speaks of suffering as an opportunity for growth. In Romans 5 verses 3-5 he says, "We rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces perseverance, and perseverance, character, and character, hope." This teaches us that although suffering is difficult, it can also shape us, strengthen us, and draw us closer to God. The Bible's message about suffering is not that it will disappear from our lives, but that God will give us the strength to face it. It assures us that in the end all pain will be redeemed and restored in His perfect timing. Have you wondered how God can use suffering in your life? Stay, because in the next segment, we'll explore stories that show how pain can be turned into hope and purpose. Biblical comfort in suffering. The Bible is full of stories that inspire us and show us how God transforms pain into hope. One such story is that of Joseph, Jacob's son. Joseph was betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, and unjustly imprisoned. For years he endured a series of sufferings that seemed endless. However, God never abandoned him. Despite the adversities, Joseph remained faithful to God. And in perfect timing, the Lord elevated him to a position of power in Egypt, making him Pharaoh's second in command. The most striking thing about his story is how God used his suffering for a greater purpose: to save his family and an entire nation from a devastating famine. Joseph summed it up this way, "You meant evil, but God meant it for good." Genesis 50 verse 20. Another example is that of Hannah, the mother of the prophet Samuel. Hannah suffered deeply for not being able to bear children. Her pain led her to cry out to God with tears and supplications. God heard her prayer and in His time, granted her a son who would be a great spiritual leader for Israel. Her story reminds us that God sees our tears and hears our prayers. These stories not only inspire us, but they show us a pattern. God does not waste suffering. He uses it to shape, strengthen, and fulfill His purposes in our lives. If you are going through a time of pain, remember that your story is not over. Just as Joseph and Hannah found redemption and purpose in the midst of their trials, you too can find hope in God. In the next segment, we will explore how God's timing, though different from ours, is always perfect. Stay to discover how this truth can transform your perspective. Stories of hope in the Bible. One of the greatest challenges we face in times of grief is understanding God's timing. Why does He take so long to respond? Why does He allow things to fall apart before He acts? These are valid questions, but the Bible assures us that God's timing is perfect, even though we often don't understand it. Hannah, our protagonist, discovered this truth during her grieving process. At first, she demanded immediate answers. Why me? Why now? But over time, she began to perceive that, although she didn't have all the answers, God was working in her life in ways she couldn't see. A biblical example of this reality is found in the life of Abraham. God promised him numerous descendants, but he and Sarah waited decades before having Isaac. During that time, they likely felt frustrated, confused, and even doubted God's promises. However, when the time came, they realized that God's plan was greater than they could have imagined. Waiting isn't easy, but it's in those moments that our faith is strengthened. Isaiah 40 verse 31 reminds us, "Those who wait for the Lord will renew their strength and mount up with wings like eagles." Waiting on God isn't inactivity, it's active trust in His wisdom and power. In the moments of greatest uncertainty, Anna began to experience peace. She realized the answer wasn't in understanding the why, but in trusting the who. God was with her every step of the way, and His perfect timing began to reveal itself through small, daily miracles. If you feel stuck in uncertainty, remember that God hasn't forgotten His promises to you. In the next segment, we'll talk about how spiritual healing can begin, even in the midst of pain. Stay to discover it. God's perfect timing. Spiritual healing is a journey, not a destination. For Anna, this process began when she stopped focusing on unanswered questions and began seeking God in her pain. Although healing seemed impossible at first, with each passing day, she discovered small glimmers of comfort that came directly from her faith. The Bible shows us that spiritual healing requires surrender. In Matthew 11 verse 28, Jesus tells us, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Anna took these words as a personal challenge. In her darkest moments, she knelt in prayer, not only asking for strength, but also surrendering her burden to the only one who could carry it. Another fundamental aspect of her healing was surrounding herself with a community of faith. She found support in others who had faced similar losses. Their testimonies not only inspired her but reminded her that she was not alone. Hebrews 10 verses 24 to 25 encourages us, "Let us consider how to stir one another toward love and good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together." Anna also began to find healing by immersing herself in God's Word. Passages like Psalm 23 verse 4 gave her comfort. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." These words became an anchor for her soul. Although the healing wasn't immediate or perfect, each small step was a reminder that God was at work in her life. Her pain didn't disappear completely, but she began to see it differently. It was no longer an impossible burden to bear, but an opportunity to experience God's grace in a deeper way. Wondering how to begin your own healing process? Stay with us, because in the next segment we'll talk about how to find purpose even in the midst of suffering. Spiritual healing process. In the midst of pain, a recurring question is, what purpose can there be in this? Hannah asked herself this same question when everything seemed dark. At first, her suffering made no sense. However, over time, she began to discover that God could use her experience for something much greater. The Bible teaches us that God can transform the most difficult circumstances into opportunities for His glory. Romans 8 verse 28 reminds us, "We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him." This doesn't mean that pain is good, but rather that God can use it to produce something good. Hannah found purpose in her suffering when she decided to help others who were also experiencing loss. She began sharing her testimony in support groups and within her faith community. Her words, born of experience, inspired others and gave them hope. A biblical example of this is the story of Joseph. Sold into slavery by his own brothers, Joseph faced years of suffering and betrayal. But in the end, he recognized that everything he had been through had a purpose. In Genesis 50 verse 20, Joseph tells his brothers, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." Suffering also makes us more empathetic. Hannah discovered that, through her pain, she was able to better understand those facing similar situations. Her experience prepared her to be an instrument of comfort and encouragement in God's hands. If you are facing a difficult time, remember that your pain is not in vain. God can use even the darkest moments to shape your character, strengthen your faith, and help you impact the lives of others. In the next segment, we'll explore the eternal hope that faith offers us. Don't miss it. Purpose in suffering. Suffering may seem endless, but the Christian faith offers us a hope that transcends this world. For Hannah, this hope became her anchor. Although she lost her son, she understood that death is not the end for those who trust in God. Jesus promised us eternal life. In John 14 verses 2 to 3, he says, "In my Father's house there are many mansions. I go to prepare a place for you." These words reminded Hannah that her son was not lost, but was with God, waiting for the day when they would be reunited. Eternal hope allows us to look beyond our current circumstances. In Revelation 21 verse 4, we read, "He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain." This verse assures us that God has a perfect plan to eradicate suffering and death. Hannah found comfort in knowing that her pain had a limit. This life is temporary, but eternity with God is forever. This thought not only lightened her burden, but also motivated her to live each day with renewed purpose. Eternal hope also gives us strength to face trials. Anna learned that trusting in God's promises doesn't take away the pain, but it makes it bearable. Knowing there is something beyond this world allowed her to find peace in the midst of her storm. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to live with the certainty of eternal hope? This promise is available to all who trust in God. In the next segment, we'll explore how you can apply these truths in your daily life and how to share this hope with others. Eternal hope. We've reached the end of this journey, but before we close, I want to share something important with you. Perhaps throughout this video, you've identified with Anna's pain, her doubts, or her healing process. Maybe you've even asked yourself, and me? Where is God in my story? God hasn't forgotten you. He is with you even in the darkest moments. Life presents us with difficult trials, but as we've seen, each one has the potential to transform our lives if we allow God to work in us. Anna found comfort and purpose by opening her heart to God, and you can too. Throughout this video, we've explored profound questions, found answers in God's Word, and discovered that suffering can be turned into hope. Now the choice is in your hands. You can continue struggling alone, or you can cast your burdens on Him who said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Matthew 11 verse 28. I want to invite you to do something practical today. Take a moment to reflect on what you've heard. If you're going through a difficult time, talk to God. You don't need perfect words, just be honest. He is there listening. If this story has inspired you, I encourage you to share it. Someone you know might be needing this message right now. Click the share button and send it to your friends and family. Together we can be instruments of hope. Finally, I want to ask you a favor. If this content has touched your heart, please subscribe to this channel. Here we share more messages like this, designed to strengthen your faith, give you hope, and remind you that you are not alone. Activate the bell so you don't miss a video. Thank you for staying until the end. Remember, suffering doesn't have the last word. God transforms pain into purpose and offers us eternal hope. See you in the next video. Hope in God.